Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Lafayette. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the year 1850, when Lafayette Parish still went by the name of Vermillionville, a settlement established just 29 years prior by Jean Mouton and surveyor John Dinsmore, the disappearance occurred. The parish, formed in 1823 and named after the Marquis de Lafayette, was at the height of its antebellum prosperity. Sugar and cotton plantations dotted the fertile lands surrounding the Vermilion River, their fields cultivated by the labor of enslaved people who made up nearly half of the parish's population. It was against this backdrop of southern wealth, built on human bondage, that the strange case of Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel unfolded, a case that would perplex investigators for years and eventually be sealed away in parish archives until its accidental rediscovery in 1968. The Godwin plantation, named Whispering Willows, sat on the eastern bank of the Vermilion River, approximately 4 miles north of Vermilionville Center. The property spanned some 800 acres, with 300 dedicated to cotton and another 200 to sugar cane. Ezra Godwin had inherited the plantation from his father, William Godwin, who had established it in 1822 after relocating from Virginia. The house itself was a classic example of Greek Revival architecture, with 6 imposing columns supporting a wide gallery that wrapped around 3 sides of the structure. What distinguished the property from others in the area was its proximity to a dense cypress grove that extended from the northeastern corner of the estate and continued for nearly a mile along a tributary of the Vermilion. What has confounded historians and those who have studied the case is not simply the mystery of what happened to Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel, but the sheer volume of contradictory evidence and testimonies that emerged in the days and weeks following their disappearance. The discovery of Ezra's silver pocket watch, a family heirloom engraved with his initials, hanging from a branch near the edge of the cypress grove, yet with no signs of a struggle. The multiple conflicting sightings of Mire in Vermilionville on the day after she was supposedly last seen at the Godwin plantation. The peculiar testimony of Jacob Thibodeau, a local fisherman who claimed to have seen a woman matching Mire's description boarding a steamboat at the New Iberia landing, yet official manifests showed no female passengers embarking at that stop on the day in question. Most peculiar of all was the page torn from Ezra's journal, dated 2 days before the disappearance, discovered months later tucked into a book in the parish courthouse library. It contained only a cryptic line, written in what handwriting experts would later confirm was indeed Ezra's own hand. The boundary between what is known and what must never be known grows thinner each day. I fear I have already stepped across. The Godwin family had been fixtures of Lafayette Parish society since their arrival in the 1820s. William Godwin, Ezra's father, had quickly established himself as one of the most successful planters in the region, known both for the quality of his cotton and for his relatively moderate views on politics. Unlike many of his contemporaries, William had encouraged his son to pursue an education in the North, sending Ezra to study at Harvard in 1840. Upon his return to Lafayette in 1845, Ezra had assumed increasingly greater control over the plantation's operations, implementing modern agricultural techniques he had learned about during his travels in Europe following his graduation. Ezra himself was described by those who knew him as a peculiar mix of Southern gentleman and Northern intellectual. At 30 years of age in 1850, he was considered somewhat of an oddity among the planter class, a man who quoted Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman with the same ease as he discussed crop rotation and soil management. He wore his dark hair longer than was fashionable, kept a neatly trimmed beard, and was known for his preference for simple, practical clothing rather than the ostentatious styles favored by many of his peers. His eyes, described as uncommonly penetrating by several acquaintances, were a striking pale green that contrasted sharply with his sun-darkened skin. Ezra had taken over full management of Whispering Willows following his father's death in 1848. William Godwin had succumbed to yellow fever during an outbreak that claimed nearly 50 lives in the parish that summer. Ezra's mother had passed away years earlier, during his childhood, leaving him as the sole heir to the Godwin estate and fortune. At the time of his father's death, the plantation was valued at approximately $75,000, a considerable sum that placed the Godwins among the wealthier families in the region, though not at the very top of the social hierarchy. Mire Chastel's background was far more enigmatic, and it is this obscurity that has fueled much of the speculation surrounding the case over the years. What is known with certainty is that she arrived in Vermilionville in early 1850, ostensibly to serve as a governess for the children of Pierre Arsenault, a prominent merchant in the town. She was described as being in her mid-20s, with the distinctive copper-toned skin and features that marked her as a free woman of color, likely of mixed French and African ancestry. According to the few accounts that exist, she spoke impeccable French with a distinct New Orleans accent, as well as fluent English. She carried with her letters of introduction from a respected Creole family in New Orleans, the Delacroix, who vouched for her education and character. What remains unclear, and what subsequent investigations failed to fully resolve, was the precise nature of Mireille's status and background. Records from New Orleans show no Mire Chastel among the rolls of free people of color in the city. The Delacroix family, when questioned years later, denied any knowledge of writing letters of introduction for her. Yet multiple witnesses in Vermilionville confirmed seeing these documents, including the parish priest, Father Etienne Guillot, who specifically recalled the quality of the stationery and the distinctive seal of the Delacroix family. The first documented meeting between Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel occurred at a parish council meeting in March of 1850, approximately 6 weeks before their disappearance. Arsenault had brought Mire to the meeting, which was focused on funding for a new schoolhouse in Vermilionville. According to the minutes of the meeting preserved in the parish archives, Mire spoke eloquently about the importance of education, drawing on her experiences in New Orleans. Ezra, serving as the secretary for the meeting, is recorded as having asked her several questions about teaching methods and curriculum. Those who witnessed this exchange later recalled nothing unusual about it, merely a polite conversation between educated individuals on a matter of community importance. What transpired between that initial meeting and the day of their disappearance on April 27, 1850, is largely conjecture. Several people reported seeing Ezra and Mire engaged in conversation at various locations around Vermilionville over the following weeks: at the general store, outside the church after Sunday services, and once at the small lending library that operated out of the back of the apothecary. None of these interactions appeared improper or secretive. They were conducted in public and seemed to revolve around shared intellectual interests, particularly literature and education. The events immediately preceding the disappearance, however, are where the documented facts begin to diverge from the whispered stories that would circulate through Lafayette Parish in the months and years that followed. According to the official investigation, conducted by Sheriff Thomas Mouton, a distant cousin of Jean Mouton, the town's founder, Mire Chastel was last seen leaving the Arsenault home on the afternoon of April 26th, stating that she intended to visit a seamstress in town regarding alterations to a dress. She never returned. Ezra Godwin was last seen by his overseer, James Barnett, on the evening of the same day, having dinner alone in the dining room of the plantation house. When Barnett arrived the following morning to discuss the day's work assignments, he found the house empty with no sign of disturbance. The alarm was not immediately raised in either case. Pierre Arsenault assumed that Mire had been detained in town, perhaps visiting with acquaintances. James Barnett assumed that Ezra had risen early and ridden out to inspect the fields, as he sometimes did. It was only when Ezra failed to return for an important meeting with a cotton buyer from New Orleans that afternoon that Barnett became concerned and began searching the property. By evening, with no sign of Ezra, he rode into Vermilionville to alert the authorities. Meanwhile, the Arsenault family had grown increasingly worried about Mireille's absence and had begun inquiring with friends and neighbors. When Sheriff Mouton received Barnett's report about Ezra's disappearance, he immediately recognized the unusual coincidence of two people going missing on the same day. The official search began the following morning. The investigation initially focused on the possibility of foul play, perhaps committed by runaway slaves or bandits known to operate along the Vermilion River. These theories were quickly abandoned, however, when searchers discovered Ezra's horse in its stable, properly groomed and fed, indicating he had not left on horseback. Similarly, all of Mireille's belongings remained in her room at the Arsenault home, including a small silver locket containing what appeared to be a lock of dark hair, which she was known to wear daily. The discovery of Ezra's pocket watch 3 days into the search shifted the focus to the cypress grove northeast of the plantation house. The watch, a valuable gold timepiece that had belonged to Ezra's grandfather, was found hanging from a low branch, its chain carefully wrapped around the limb. It was in perfect working condition, wound and keeping accurate time, with no signs of damage or exposure to the elements. The surrounding area showed no signs of a struggle or disturbance. The peculiarity of this discovery, a valuable item deliberately left where it would likely be found, suggested to investigators that its placement was intentional, perhaps as a message or clue. An exhaustive search of the cypress grove and the surrounding areas yielded no further evidence. No bodies, no blood, no torn clothing or personal effects. Nothing to indicate what might have happened to Ezra Godwin and Mireille Chastel. The case might have remained a simple, if peculiar, disappearance, were it not for what happened next, the beginning of the whispers that would transform a missing persons case into one of the most enduring mysteries in Lafayette Parish history. 10 days after the disappearances, Marie Comeau, a washerwoman who worked for several families in Vermilionville, including the Arsenauts, came forward with an alarming claim. She stated that she had seen Ezra and Mireille together on multiple occasions in the weeks before they vanished, in circumstances that suggested a relationship far more intimate than casual acquaintances. According to Comeau, she had observed them meeting in a small clearing near the cypress grove, speaking in hushed tones and standing closer than propriety would dictate. On one occasion, she claimed to have seen them holding hands. Most significantly, she reported overhearing fragments of their conversation, including Ezra saying something about escaping north, and Mireille responding that it was too dangerous, too impossible. Comeau's testimony dramatically altered the nature of the investigation. Sheriff Mouton was now faced with the explosive possibility that a white plantation owner and a free woman of color had been engaged in a clandestine relationship, one that violated not only social norms but also Louisiana law, which expressly prohibited marriage between whites and people of color. If they had indeed fled together, they would have been breaking multiple statutes and risking severe punishment if caught. The reaction in Vermilionville was swift and divisive. Many refused to believe that Ezra Godwin, a respected member of the community, would engage in such a relationship. Others pointed to his northern education and his occasionally expressed views on equality as evidence that he might indeed harbor such radical sentiments. Pierre Arsenault vehemently denied the possibility, insisting that Mire was a woman of impeccable character who would never involve herself in anything so improper. James Barnett, however, reluctantly admitted that Ezra had shown an unusual interest in the education and welfare of the enslaved people on the plantation, even teaching several of them to read in defiance of Louisiana law. As the investigation progressed, more witnesses came forward with accounts of seeing Ezra and Mire together. A stable boy claimed to have delivered notes between them. A shopkeeper recalled them examining maps of the northern states together. Each new testimony added weight to the theory that they had planned their disappearance as an escape from the rigid racial hierarchy of the South. Yet there were troubling inconsistencies that prevented the case from being so easily resolved. The timing made little sense. Why would they leave separately on different parts of the same day, rather than meeting at a predetermined location and departing together? Why would Ezra leave behind his horse, making travel more difficult? Why would Mire not take her few precious possessions? And why would Ezra leave his valuable watch in the cypress grove, potentially providing a clue to their departure? The most perplexing evidence emerged 3 weeks after the disappearances, when a fisherman named Etienne Broussard reported finding a small leather-bound journal wedged between rocks along the bank of the Vermilion River, approximately 2 miles downstream from the Godwin plantation. The journal, its pages swollen with moisture but still largely legible, contained entries in Ezra's handwriting spanning the 2 months prior to his disappearance. Sheriff Mouton took possession of the journal and, after reviewing its contents, made the unusual decision to share only selected excerpts with the investigation team, sealing the remainder away in the parish records. The excerpts that were made public painted a complex picture. Ezra wrote of meeting Mire and being immediately struck by her intelligence and dignity. He described conversations about literature, philosophy, and the condition of society. There were passages expressing his growing disillusionment with the institution of slavery and the social order of the South. But there was nothing explicitly romantic or improper in the portions released, leading many to question why the sheriff had chosen to withhold the remainder of the journal. It would be more than a century before the full contents of the journal were revealed, when a graduate student researching antebellum Louisiana discovered the sealed records in 1968. By then, the case had passed from current events into local legend, with numerous embellishments and variations. What the complete journal revealed, however, was far stranger than any of the speculative narratives that had developed around the case over the decades. The entries from April, the month of the disappearance, described not a romantic relationship between Ezra and Mire, but a shared investigation into something far more disturbing. According to Ezra's writings, Mire had approached him not out of personal interest, but because she believed he might help her uncover the truth behind a series of disappearances that had occurred in and around Lafayette Parish over the previous decade, disappearances that had gone largely uninvestigated because the missing persons were all people of color, either enslaved or free. Mire, according to Ezra's account, had come to Vermilionville specifically to investigate these cases, having lost a cousin to whatever or whoever was responsible. She had adopted the identity of a governess as a cover for her true purpose. In Ezra, educated and somewhat sympathetic to the plight of non-whites, she had found an unexpected ally. Together, they had begun piecing together a pattern that pointed to something organized and deliberate, not random accidents or escapes, but calculated removals of specific individuals who shared certain characteristics or knowledge. The final entries in the journal grew increasingly paranoid and fragmented. Ezra wrote of being watched, of strange noises outside his window at night, of documents and notes going missing from his study. The very last entry, dated April 25th, contained a chilling passage. M believes we are close to the truth. Too close, perhaps. She has found a connection between the missing and a name that appears in parish records from before my father's time. A name that should not exist, that cannot exist. We will meet tomorrow to compare what we have learned. If we are right, God help us all. If we are wrong, may God still help us, for I fear we have drawn the attention of something that will not stop until we too are among the missing. That was the final entry. The following day, both Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel disappeared, never to be seen again. What had they discovered? What name had Mire found in the parish records? The journal offered no clear answers, only unsettling questions. The graduate student who rediscovered the case in 1968 attempted to follow the same trail, searching through the records that Ezra and Mire might have accessed. Many of those records, however, had been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1872, leaving significant gaps in the documentary history of the parish. The student did uncover one tantalizing clue, however. In a collection of personal papers donated to the Louisiana Historical Society by the descendants of Thomas Mouton, the sheriff who had investigated the disappearances, she found a sealed envelope with a note in Mouton's handwriting, regarding the Godwin-Chastel matter, to be destroyed upon my death. The envelope had evidently been overlooked when Mouton's instructions were carried out. Inside was a single page, torn from what appeared to be Ezra's journal, but which had not been included in the material found by the fisherman. It contained just 3 lines. The name is Godwin, my own family. 3 generations of disappearances, all concealed, all connected to the same terrible purpose. I cannot comprehend what my father, my grandfather have done, but I must know the full truth, whatever the cost. The implications of this fragment are staggering. Was Ezra suggesting that his own family had been responsible for the disappearances that he and Mire were investigating? Had he uncovered some dark legacy that stretched back through multiple generations of Godwins? And what terrible purpose could have motivated such actions? In the absence of conclusive evidence, theories proliferated. Some suggested human trafficking, with the missing persons being sold into slavery in other states or countries. Others proposed more sinister explanations: ritual killings, medical experimentation, or even cannibalism. None of these theories could be proven or disproven, given the limited remaining evidence. What is known is that in the year following the disappearances, James Barnett, Ezra's overseer, took over management of the plantation on behalf of Ezra's distant cousins in Virginia, who inherited the property when Ezra was declared legally dead in 1851. Under Barnett's management, sections of the plantation closest to the cypress grove were abandoned, with agricultural operations concentrated on the western portions of the property. Local residents reported avoiding the cypress grove, claiming it felt wrong or watched. The Whispering Willows plantation house itself was destroyed by fire in 1865 during the closing days of the Civil War, eliminating any physical evidence that might have remained there. Pierre Arsenault, who had employed Mire as a governess, left Vermillionville in 1852, relocating his family to New Orleans. Before his departure, he was reported to have told close friends that he could no longer live in a place where the air itself seems poisoned by secrets. Sheriff Thomas Mouton continued to serve until 1860, when he retired and moved to a small property near Baton Rouge. His official records note that he periodically reopened the investigation into the Godwin-Chastel disappearances, but never made any significant progress. His personal papers, however, suggest that he continued to harbor deep concerns about the case until his death in 1875. Among his effects was found a loaded pistol that he apparently kept with him at all times, along with a medallion of Saint Michael, the patron saint of protection against evil. Marie Comeau, the washerwoman whose testimony had first suggested a relationship between Ezra and Mire, recanted her statement in 1853, claiming she had been pressured to provide false information. She refused to elaborate on who had pressured her or why, even when faced with charges of interfering with an investigation. She died under unclear circumstances the following year, her body found in a shallow grave near the very cypress grove where Ezra's watch had been discovered. Etienne Broussard, the fisherman who found Ezra's journal, left Lafayette Parish shortly after turning the journal over to authorities. He reportedly told neighbors that he was moving to California, drawn by the lingering promise of the gold rush. No record of his arrival in California exists, nor does any further documentation of his life appear in any known archives. The fate of Ezra Godwin and Mireille Chastel remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Lafayette Parish history. Were they murdered to prevent them from exposing some terrible secret? Did they flee together, either as lovers or as fellow investigators who had stumbled upon something too dangerous to confront? Or did they meet some other, even more inexplicable end? In 1895, a curious postscript to the case emerged when a retired professor from Harvard University visited Lafayette Parish while researching a book on Southern architecture. During his stay, he mentioned to local historians that he had been a classmate of Ezra Godwin's. In the course of conversation, he recalled something unusual. Ezra had been particularly interested in his family history, often speaking of a grandfather who had conducted scientific studies of human capability on the plantation. The professor had assumed this referred to agricultural innovations, but in retrospect, he wondered if there might have been a more sinister implication. This tantalizing suggestion might have led to renewed investigation, had not the professor died unexpectedly the night after sharing this recollection, suffering what was described as a seizure of the heart while dining alone in his hotel room. With his death, another potential thread of the mystery was severed. The last significant development in the case came in 1972, when construction workers clearing land for a housing development near the site of the former cypress grove discovered a sealed iron box buried approximately 6 feet below the surface. The box contained a collection of small objects: a woman's ivory hair comb, a man's signet ring bearing the Godwin family crest, a small key that did not match any known lock, and a folded piece of paper with a message written in what appeared to be a substitution cipher. Despite numerous attempts by amateur and professional cryptographers, the cipher has never been successfully decoded. Today, the land where Whispering Willows plantation once stood is divided among several private properties and a small municipal park. The cypress grove has long since been cleared, replaced by modern development. Nothing remains of the physical setting where Ezra Godwin and Mireille Chastel lived their final documented days. Yet their story persists in local legend and academic interest, a reminder of the dark undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of antebellum Southern society. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to this disturbing tale comes from the words of an elderly woman interviewed by the graduate student who rediscovered the case in 1968. The woman, then in her 90s, claimed that her grandmother had been a house servant at a neighboring plantation in 1850. According to family law passed down through generations, her grandmother had always maintained that the story people told about Ezra and Mire running away together was wrong. "They didn't run," the old woman quoted her grandmother as saying. "They were taken, and they weren't the first, and they weren't the last." Some things in this world are better left alone, and some secrets are kept not to protect the guilty, but to protect the innocent from knowing what the guilty have done. Whether those words contain wisdom or merely add another layer to the mystery of Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel is for each listener to decide. What remains certain is that in the spring of 1850, two people vanished from Lafayette Parish, leaving behind questions that have endured for over a century. Questions about justice, about history, and about the capacity of human beings to conceal horrible truths beneath a veneer of civilization and propriety. The sounds of the cypress grove have long since fallen silent. The whispers that once passed through Vermilionville have faded to echoes. But somewhere, perhaps, the truth still waits to be discovered, or to claim another who dares to seek it out. What few documents remain from the original investigation suggest that Sheriff Mouton had more information than he ever made public. His personal journal, discovered in the attic of his granddaughter's home in 1984, contains cryptic references to the chamber beneath and instruments unlike any doctor would use. These fragments tantalize, but ultimately reveal little concrete information. More telling, perhaps, is the fact that several pages appear to have been carefully removed from the journal, with only the ragged edges remaining as evidence of their former presence. The historical record shows that in the months following the disappearances, several enslaved people from neighboring plantations attempted to escape, a notable increase from previous years. Those who were captured and returned refused to explain their motivations, even under severe punishment. One man who had been caught less than 10 miles from the Godwin plantation reportedly told his interrogators only that death in the swamp is better than what waits in the dark. He was subsequently sold to a plantation in Georgia, his fate lost to history like so many others. In 1851, approximately 1 year after the disappearances of Ezra and Mire, a surveyor named William Holcomb was hired by James Barnett to assess the Godwin property for potential expansion of the agricultural areas. Holcomb's report, preserved in the parish records, notes an unusual feature on the northeastern edge of the estate, a small stone structure partially buried in the side of a low hill, which did not appear on any existing maps of the property. Holcomb described it as a doorway to nowhere, sealed with mortar and stones of more recent placement than the surrounding frame. He recommended avoiding development in that area due to unsuitable drainage conditions, though modern geologists examining the original survey maps find no evidence of poor drainage in that location. There is no record of anyone investigating this structure at the time. Holcomb's report was filed away, and development of the plantation proceeded according to Barnett's original plans, focusing on the western portions of the property. The location of the stone doorway, if it ever truly existed, was gradually reclaimed by wilderness as the cypress grove expanded in the years of neglect during and after the Civil War. In 1975, an architectural historian named Catherine Devereux became interested in the Godwin-Chastel case after reading about it in a collection of Louisiana mysteries. She obtained permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area where the Whispering Willows plantation house had once stood, as well as portions of the former cypress grove that had not yet been developed. Her preliminary findings, published in a small academic journal, indicated several anomalies beneath the surface, spaces where the ground density changed in ways consistent with buried structures or chambers. Before she could conduct more detailed investigations, however, Devereux suffered a severe allergic reaction while working at the site. Although she recovered physically, colleagues reported that she refused to continue the research, citing ethical concerns about disturbing certain types of historical remains. When pressed for clarification, she would only say that some aspects of history cast shadows long after the events themselves have passed into memory. She left academia shortly thereafter and reportedly moved to New Mexico, where she lived in relative seclusion until her death in 2002. The most recent chapter in this enduring mystery began in 2008, when renovations to the Lafayette Parish Courthouse uncovered a sealed compartment within a wall that had been scheduled for demolition. Inside was a small leather case containing what appeared to be medical or surgical tools of unusual design, along with a journal written in a coded script similar to the cipher found in the iron box in 1972. A note accompanying these items, written in what experts confirmed was Sheriff Mouton's handwriting, stated simply, "Evidence in the matter of disappearances connected to Whispering Willows, not to be opened, to be sealed within the courthouse walls upon my retirement. Forensic analysis of the tools revealed traces of human blood and tissue." Carbon dating placed their manufacture in the early 19th century, consistent with the period when William Godwin, Ezra's father, had established the plantation. The journal, despite intensive efforts by cryptographers, has yet to be fully decoded. The few fragments that have been deciphered describe what appear to be medical procedures, but with terminology and objectives that do not align with any known medical practice of the era, or indeed of any era. In 2010, a descendant of the Godwin family, living in Massachusetts and previously unaware of this chapter in her family history, provided researchers with access to family papers that had been preserved through generations. Among these documents was a letter from William Godwin to his brother in Virginia, dated 1824, which contained a disturbing passage. "The work father began continues here, with greater success than he achieved. The subjects are more resilient, their constitutions better suited to the procedures. I have had to ensure complete secrecy, as the local population would not understand the scientific importance of these studies. Ezra shows promise and interest in the natural sciences. I hope that in time he may be brought into our family's true legacy." This letter strongly suggests that whatever activities were taking place at Whispering Willows had their origins not with Ezra or even his father, but with his grandfather, and that these activities were deliberately concealed from public knowledge due to their nature. The reference to subjects and procedures implies some form of experimentation, possibly medical in nature, while the mention of resilience and constitution suggests these experiments were conducted on living people. When considered alongside the pattern of disappearances that Ezra and Mire were investigating, disappearances specifically of people of color, a disturbing possibility emerges. Was the Godwin family, across multiple generations, conducting some form of unauthorized and unethical medical experimentation on enslaved people and free people of color? And if so, what was the purpose of these experiments? Historical context provides some possible, if unsettling, explanations. The early to mid-19th century was a period when scientific racism was becoming codified in American and European thought. Physicians and scientists sought to prove inherent biological differences between races, often through deeply flawed and unethical studies. Simultaneously, medical science was advancing rapidly but was hindered by ethical and legal restrictions on dissection and experimentation. Some researchers have proposed that the Godwin family may have been involved in a clandestine network of individuals who used enslaved people as unwilling subjects for medical research. Research that could not be conducted openly due to its nature, but which was rationalized by its perpetrators as necessary for scientific advancement. The isolation of rural plantations, the complete power that owners exercised over enslaved people, and the social disregard for the humanity of black individuals would have created conditions where such activities could potentially continue for years without detection. If this was indeed what Ezra discovered, that his family had been engaged in such practices for generations, it would explain both his horror, as expressed in his journal, and the danger he and Mire faced in pursuing their investigation. It would also explain why local authorities might have been motivated to obscure certain aspects of the case. Exposing such activities could have had widespread implications for other prominent families who might have been involved or complicit. Yet this theory, while supported by some of the evidence, does not fully explain all aspects of the case. It does not account for the cryptic references in Ezra's journal to a name that should not exist, that cannot exist. It does not explain why Ezra and Mire disappeared simultaneously but separately, nor why Ezra would leave his watch hanging in the cypress grove. And it does not resolve the question of what ultimately happened to them, whether they were murdered, fled, or met some other fate. In 2015, a professor of anthropology from Tulane University proposed an alternative interpretation based on a comprehensive review of all available evidence. She suggested that Ezra, upon discovering his family's dark activities, might not have immediately rejected them, but instead may have initially been drawn into them, perhaps believing, as his father's letter suggested he might, in their scientific necessity. His meeting with Mire and his exposure to her investigation could have triggered a moral awakening, leading him to plan not just an escape, but an exposure of these practices. Under this interpretation, the watch in the cypress grove was not a clue but a renunciation, Ezra leaving behind a symbol of his family legacy as he prepared to destroy it. The separate disappearances might have been a strategic decision meant to confuse pursuers, and the journal entries, with their increasingly paranoid tone, might reflect not just fear of external threats, but Ezra's internal struggle with his own complicity and legacy. This theory gained additional support in 2019, when archaeological work at the site of a former outbuilding on the Godwin plantation uncovered a hidden subfloor chamber containing human remains. Forensic analysis indicated that the individuals had died between 1820 and 1840, with evidence of surgical procedures performed both before and after death. DNA analysis of the remains showed that all were of African or mixed African-European ancestry. Perhaps most disturbingly, several of the remains showed signs of having been restrained for extended periods while still alive. The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the entire former plantation grounds, though much of the area had been significantly altered by more than a century of development. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies identified several additional anomalies that may represent similar chambers or burial sites, but legal and logistical challenges have thus far prevented further excavation. The implications of these findings are profound, not just for understanding the Godwin-Chastel case, but for comprehending the full depths of the horrors that could exist within the system of slavery, horrors that went beyond the already immense suffering inherent in forced labor and dehumanization. They suggest that for some enslaved individuals, there existed fates even worse than the daily brutality of plantation life, fates deliberately concealed from historical record by those who perpetrated them. As for Ezra and Mire themselves, their ultimate fate remains unknown. No bodies definitively identified as theirs have ever been found. No records exist of them living elsewhere under different names. They simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the fragments of their investigation. Some locals in Lafayette Parish maintain that on certain nights, particularly when fog rises from the Vermilion River and shrouds the former plantation lands, strange lights can be seen moving among the trees that have reclaimed portions of the property. Others claim to have heard voices, a man and a woman, speaking urgently but too softly to be understood. Scientists dismiss these accounts as folklore and optical illusions, natural phenomena given supernatural interpretation through the lens of a compelling historical mystery. Perhaps the most fitting conclusion to this narrative comes not from the historical record or modern investigation, but from a poem found scratched into the wall of an abandoned well on what was once Godwin land. Discovered during a drought in 1958 when the water level dropped, the text has been tentatively dated to the late 19th century based on linguistic analysis. Whether it has any actual connection to Ezra and Mire is impossible to determine, but its themes resonate hauntingly with their story. We sought the truth beneath the lies, beneath the soil where darkness waits. What we found, no soul should know, yet knowing, we could not turn away. Now we wander neither here nor there, between the worlds of life and death, bound together by shared horror and the promise to remember. Seek us not in graves or records, our names are whispers now, nothing more. But when justice finally comes to this land, perhaps then we may truly rest. The case of Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel, whether understood as a tragic romance cut short by the racial prejudices of their time, as the exposure of a generations-long atrocity, or as something else entirely, continues to resonate because it touches on fundamental questions about our history and humanity. It reminds us that beneath the manicured surfaces of even the most respectable historical narratives may lie truths far more complex and disturbing than we are prepared to acknowledge. In Lafayette Parish today, few physical remnants exist of Whispering Willows plantation or the events that transpired there in the spring of 1850. The land has been subdivided, developed and transformed by the passage of time and the relentless advance of modernity. Yet something of that history persists, not just in documents and artifacts, but in the collective memory of a community, a sense that some chapters of the past are not quite closed, some voices not entirely silenced. As we look back across the span of more than a century and a half, we cannot know with certainty what Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel discovered, or what became of them after they stepped into the shadows of history. We can only piece together fragments of evidence and possibility, constructing narratives that may approach but never fully capture the truth. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant not to be solved definitively, but to remain open, challenging us to confront the darkest aspects of our shared past, and to acknowledge that there are depths to human experience, both in suffering and in resistance to suffering, that can never be fully articulated or understood by those who come after. What we do know is that on an April day in 1850, two people disappeared from Lafayette Parish, a white plantation owner and a free woman of color, leaving behind questions that continue to echo through time. In their disappearance, in the fragments they left behind, and in our continuing fascination with their story, they achieve a kind of immortality. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but a continuing conversation, and that the past is never as distant or as settled as we might wish it to be. The cypress trees have grown back in places, their roots reaching deep into soil that holds untold secrets. The Vermilion River continues its slow journey, carrying away a little more of the land with each passing year. And somewhere in Lafayette Parish, perhaps in an archive still unopened, in a forgotten corner of an old building, or buried beneath the foundations of modern life, further pieces of the puzzle may wait. Clues that might someday shed new light on the strange case of Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel, a mystery that has endured for generations and shows no sign of releasing its hold on our imagination. In the final analysis, perhaps what draws us to their story is not the possibility of solving the mystery, but the recognition that some mysteries touch on truths too profound for simple resolution. Truths about power and vulnerability, about complicity and resistance, about the human capacity for both terrible cruelty and remarkable courage in the face of that cruelty. In the silence that surrounds their disappearance, we confront not just a historical puzzle, but a mirror that reflects our own struggles with the legacies of a troubled past. And so their story continues to be told, passing from one generation to the next, neither fully historical nor entirely legend, occupying that liminal space where fact and folklore merge into something perhaps more truthful than either could be alone. In that telling and retelling, Ezra Godwin and Mire Chastel live on, reminding us that even in the darkest corners of history, there are those who seek the light of truth, whatever the cost.